Hey friends, it's Matt Popovits. For far too many, faith has become a burden. Just another frustrating part of life filled with obligation and expectation. They're wondering, why am I holding on to it? In my new book, Junk Drawer Jesus, we examine the spiritual clutter we've collected that bogs us down and wears us out. It's a guide to making space again for grace, to tossing the clutter and keeping Christ. Order your copy of Junk Drawer Jesus today and join me in rejecting the mess and rediscovering the simplicity of Christ for you.
Thanks for having us out. I'll start the way that we always start. Welcome to 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament is, of course, a 1517 Podcast Network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast. Check out all the other podcasts that are living over there. And while you're over there, you can check out everything else that 1517 is doing, which is, of course, a lot of stuff. The theme of this event, which, of course, is encountering Jesus, and then we're going to do an Old Testament podcast. How, you may ask, are we going to pull this off? How are we going to find a story to talk about where someone encounters Jesus, but we're going to be in the Old Testament to do it? Well, if you've listened to 40 Minutes in the Old Testament at all, you know that this actually wasn't that difficult of a task. It was actually a matter of which one of the Christophanies are we going to decide to talk about. And so we decided to go with one that we wanted to make this easy for Chad. He's got a lot going on. So we decided we would go with Jacob wrestling God, or, as you might come to find out, wrestling Jesus, which Chad also wrote a book on. So he should know, just so you know, you should know something about this. And so we're going to find out. So we are going to be, if you want to follow along, or it's fine if you just want to listen, but we're going to be in Genesis 32. What's the background, Chad, before we get to Jacob actually having an all-night wrestling match with the creator of heaven and earth?
Yeah, so this is, I like to describe this as the bookend to the first part of his exile. So if you know Jacob's story, he has to leave when he steals his brother's birthright because his brother wants to kill him. And so he takes off into exile. But what's the first thing that happens to him as soon as he leaves? He has this vision, this dream vision, at night when he's alone, where God appears to him. This is the whole stairway to heaven with angels ascending and descending. So that's how the exile starts. Jacob alone at night, God appears to him, speaks to him. Fast forward 20 years, he's been in exile, got married. You get it. So he's a busy guy.
Worked out great for him.
Yeah, worked out great for him. Yeah. So got the two wives, got the two co-wives, got this growing family, problems with his uncle, father-in-law, boss, wrapped in one person. Common experience for us all. That was a joke. So anyway, he's coming home, right? It's been 20 years. And so we're at the end of the exile, and once again, in Genesis 32, Jacob is alone. It's at night. God is going to appear to him, but this time he's going to do more than simply speak to him, as we shall see. So I like to put those two together so you can see that when God appears to Jacob and talks to him or does something to him, it's not always the same. And this event in itself is not only not the same compared to what Jacob has experienced elsewhere, this never happens in the rest of the scriptures. Nothing like this ever occurs in the Old Testament or the New Testament. A very unique experience. So anyway, that kind of sets the stage. He's already afraid of Esau. We've heard a little bit about that early in the chapter, and he's going to encounter Esau in the very next chapter. But this is a little segue between those, the fear and the actual encounter. So to kind of set it up, I'll just read the first couple of verses here. So Genesis 32, beginning at verse 22. Now he, that is Jacob, arose that same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. So they're almost in, Jabbok is on the east side of the Jordan River, so they're not quite over the Jordan River. And he took them, his family, and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever he had, and then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So you can jump in there, Eric.
I have nothing to add here except I remember when I first started reading my Bible, like for real, I was like, I'm going to do it, I'm going to read the whole thing. And coming to this passage and getting to that line and being like, what? What is happening here?
Yeah.
That's all I have to add at this point.
No, well,
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it leads to all kinds of questions. Now, this is probably not the question foremost in most people's minds, but as a father who raised a son who wrestled in high school, one of the things that jumps out to me is all night. But if you've wrestled or if you watch wrestling matches, these kids are in the prime of their life. They're full of energy, and after 3 or 4 minutes, they're done. They're wiped out. These guys are like going at it all night long. So that struck me. But the weird part of this is, who's this guy, right?
Yeah.
A man. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, the Hebrew is going to solve this question, right? Just look at the Hebrew. Hebrew doesn't help here. The Hebrew is ish, which just means, guess what? A man. So he's a man. Now, I don't want to steal too much of my own thunder, but if you take this narrative and you compare it with Hosea 12, which also reflects upon this same incident, you figure out that this, what do you want to call it, individual figure is called 3 things. Ish, a man. Later in Genesis 32, he's referred to as Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. Jacob will say, I have seen, he calls the place Peniel, which means the face of God. So I've seen God. So he's a man and he's God. And then Hosea adds that he is a messenger, which in Hebrew is malach, often translated angel, just means messenger. So there you go. He's a man, he is God, and he is evidently sent with a message from God. He's all 3 of these. Let's ponder. Who might that be? Let's see. God and man. Yeah. Maybe we'll come to it. All right. Just kind of sit there, think about it as we work our way through the rest of this.
Well, I'll tell you what's weird is that he doesn't ever give him this message. Like the message is just wrestling all night. Like this is the part that's weird about it is you don't have any build up to this. It's just Jacob's alone, and now he's going to wrestle this guy all night. Like you don't know. Did he say? What did he say? Did he say nothing? Did Jacob
jumped into the dark?
Yeah. Did Jacob just lay his head down, and next thing he knew, like he got pounced, and then like it's just wrestling all night long. No words. I mean, the first words that you have spoken are not till when Jesus says, "Hey, it's been all night, man." And then Jacob's like, yeah, it's going to be all day too, unless you.
And Jacob talking a little smack.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That's it. But you're like, what is this message exactly? And so that part is pretty strange.
By the way, but it's not entirely weird. I got jumped once, and they didn't say any words before they did their jumping. So I've experienced.
Are you just going to tease
that.
us with that story? Okay, that's it. That after you have to be like behind the paywall, I guess, to hear the rest of the story. Okay, all right. So he jumps him, and they wrestle until daybreak. So verse 25. Let's figure out what else happens. And when he saw, and I'm just going to add the who, the he is, because Hebrew is frustratingly ambiguous sometimes with pronouns. And he did this to him, and then he did this to them, and then they, like, who are we talking about here? So I'm going to add who these he's and hims are when I read it. And when the man saw that Jacob had not prevailed against him, the man touched the socket of Jacob's thigh, and so the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Now, if there's one message that is abundantly clear in this verse, it's this. God doesn't fight fair. Now, we laugh until that like hits us where it hurts, right? Until we're the one who's being attacked all night. And we realize God doesn't fight. He doesn't fight fair. He doesn't fight according to our rules. He doesn't play according to what people say you should and you shouldn't do. You know, we come up with our list of divine rules. This is what we think God should do and what God should not do. And God laughs because he doesn't play by our rules. And sometimes when he doesn't play by our rules, we're like, yeah, love that, you know. Sometimes we don't know what to do because we feel attacked and we don't know what in the world God might be doing, but we just know one thing: we don't like it. Because it hurts, because it's confusing, because nothing is happening according to the way that we think that it should happen.
And also, what this shows is that oftentimes God will let us wrestle with him for quite some time, thinking that we actually may even have the advantage. Like, he'll let it go for a while. He'll let us wrestle with him for a while. He'll let us run from him for a while. He might, but at any moment, he can and completely paralyze us in that moment.
Yeah. Dislocate that thigh, which is another thing to bring out. God wounds. He heals, but he also wounds. I mean, that's straight from the Bible. That's straight from Deuteronomy.
That's Job.
Yeah, that's Job. I wound and I heal. I put to death and also bring to life. So he does both of these things. And it's great when he heals. It's great when he gives life, but it's not so much fun when he wounds. It's not so much fun when he puts to death. But in order to achieve the healing, sometimes he has to dislocate that thigh. In order to bring us back to life again, sometimes he has to put us in the grave. This is the way that God works, not just in Jacob's life, but repeatedly in the scriptures. He puts down in order to lift up. He wounds in order that he might heal. Which is one of the reasons that I love Jacob's story, because Jacob is so much of a reflection of what it means to be a follower of Christ. I mean, all of his weaknesses and his foibles and his selfishness and his egotism, I mean, all of that's hard for us to identify with. Okay, there it came. Took a second.
Wait, that was
what you got there? Yeah, I mean, I see Jacob as I typically, when I'm covering his entire life, I'll point out that one of the reasons that I'm so attracted to Jacob is because he is so unlikable. And all those unlikable traits that I see in Jacob, I also see reflected in myself. But the real beauty of Jacob's life is that no matter where he's at or what he's doing, God won't leave him alone. He's always there. Just like he's always there for us. And that's why I love him as an example of what it means to be a follower of Christ, because he exemplifies our worst qualities. And his life also exemplifies God's gracious and merciful qualities in forgiving him and blessing him and shepherding his life through all of its ups and downs.
Well, this is another example of why it's problematic to, what we've talked oftentimes about, that kind of Sunday school material that presents Old Testament figures as sort of heroes to emulate. And sometimes, there's people that do come off sort of more heroic and maybe worthy of emulation than others. Jacob just kind of puts that whole way of reading the Old Testament to bed. I mean, because he really, as you're saying, is not the kind of guy you probably want to hang out with.
Yeah, he's kind of a jerk. Yeah.
And his name literally means deceiver. I mean, it's like...
I definitely don't want to be related to him.
Yeah. It's never worked out well.
Yeah. Don't want to be his brother, that's for sure.
Don't want to be his brother.
Yeah. Yeah, that's our friend Jacob. I think in 40 minutes, what if we encounter like 2 people, maybe 3 the entire time? We're like, yeah, it seems like a pretty good person.
Yeah.
That's only because it has so little to say about him.
There's one verse about him.
Yeah. Like, if you met him in real life, you'd be like, I don't know about this person. But at least in what we're told in the Bible, they seem like they're a pretty decent person. Okay, where are we at? 26. Then he said, this is Jacob speaking. No, this is the messenger speaking. Then the messenger said, or the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. And Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, doesn't that sound just like Jacob?
Mm-hmm. Heel grabber.
Yeah, he's the heel grabber. He's not gonna let him go. I mean, if there's one thing that you learn about Jacob right away in his life, is that he is going to take advantage of every opportunity that's given to him. Mm-hmm. I mean, the very first encounter that we have where Jacob speaks is when he and his brother are growing up, and Esau comes in from the field and he's famished. He's kind of a drama queen. Oh, I'm dying, I've got to eat or I'm going to die on the spot. And then Jacob takes this opportunity and he's like, okay, sell me your birthright. And first thing, right? He knows what to do. And then he makes him swear. And then, of course, the next chapter you have where he deceives his father and he knows exactly what to say, exactly what to do there with mom's help. So Jacob definitely takes advantage of these opportunities that are presented to him. And here is no different. He doesn't say, okay, I see the sun's coming up, I'll let you go. He's like, nope, not going to let you go unless you bless me.
You don't want to wrestle all night for nothing.
That's true, you got to get something out of it.
I'm getting something out of this.
What Kelsey talked about earlier, you got a reward.
Yeah.
You got to get some kind of reward.
I could have let you go a long time ago. I'm trying to get something here.
Yeah. So, 27, so the messenger says to him, what is your name? Which I just love. It's not like he didn't ask this out of ignorance, like he didn't really realize who he was wrestling with all night. Who are you anyway? I know we've been at this for quite a while, but I forgot to introduce myself. He wants Jacob to say his name because, as Eric just pointed out, Jacob's name, Yaakov, is formed from Akab or Akov, which means your heel. But the verbal form means to grab something by the heel. An example I like to use is, anyone grow up steer roping? No steer ropers in the room. Well, I did. I was raised by a cowboy father, and so I could ride a horse before I could ride a bicycle. And my dad and I were steer ropers. We were headers, but you have a header and you have a heeler. Yeah. And the purpose of the header is to rope the horns, and then you dial in, you turn, and you're pulling steer along, and the heeler comes along, and his purpose is to throw the rope so that he catches the heels of the steer, with the result that he's caught, right? You're tripping up the steer. That's Jacobing. Heeling is Jacobing. You're wanting to trip up something, to grab it by the heels in order you can stop whatever you're pursuing and get ahead. And so, as I like to say, Jacob always lived down to his name. Mm-hmm. That's what he was doing. So the brothers Harry and Heel, Jacob and Esau, Heel was always living down to exactly what his name meant. So when the messenger says to him, what's your name? He wants Jacob to remember exactly the implications of that. And so he responds, Yaakov, Jacob. Now verse 28. So he said, your name shall no longer be Heel, but Godfighter. I'd say that's pretty good improvement, right? Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, for you have striven with God or fought with God and with men and have prevailed. So if Jacob means heel, then you have Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew, which is formed from two different words. The El part at the end is God, El, which is shortened form. You can have El, you have Elohim, they both mean God. And then the first part is from the verb sarah, which means to strive with, to fight with. So Israel, I think, is the coolest name ever. I mean, Chad's a pretty cool name. Dan's a cool name. Eric's a cool name. But Israel, I mean, Godfighter? There's no, but what's your name? Most folks call me Godfighter.
Well,
okay.
and this, I mean, once again goes to show that as we continue on in the Old Testament, God never has sort of any illusions about what the broader people, Israel, are going to be like. Mm. This striving and fighting and wrestling with God is laid out for us through all of his descendants. I mean, throughout all of the Old Testament, you see the same thing.
Yeah. So Israel in that sense lives up to, down to their name.
Yeah.
God is there's no insecurities with God. Like ego is all based out of insecurity. And he doesn't have any of that. So, I mean, even God saying to Jacob, I'm going to change your name to Godfighter because, you won, is like preposterous, right? It's like, well, you won. Okay, so I'm going to change your name. God just doesn't have any, it's not, he doesn't feel like, oh, this threatens me in some way. Like, I guess you're God now, Jacob, since, you beat me and everything.
It's got to be said in the same way that I said it to my boys when we used to wrestle when they were little.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you pinned me.
Yeah, it's. I think it's exactly like that. Like God's like, well, you win, and so you see sort of this way that God is wrestling all night with Jacob, and obviously, I mean, he dislocates his hip by any time he wants to, just by touching it, and he can do far worse than this, obviously, if he wants to, but mostly wants to endure to the end here to get to this place where he can change his name and going to change kind of everything about Jacob in this moment. And you're going to see, too, that Jacob then tries to do the same thing with God, like, oh, what's your name? And you don't have a response other than God, and we're about to get there, but other than God saying, why do you ask me that? Which is the same as like, you know who it is.
Yes, right.
Like, I'm not going to tell you my name. You know exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, when I think about, well, there's many different thoughts about his name and kind of the history afterward. I mean, you can go the biblical history like you were alluding to. What does Israel do constantly with God? Well, they fight, right? They fight with him in a negative sort of way. I mean, I suppose you could fight with God positively, but Israel is always fighting with God in a negative sort of way. And the whole subsequent history of the Old Testament is full of examples of that. Now, what I like to do with that name, too, is kind of think in bigger terms. Think about the entire salvation story. So you've got Jacob wrestling with God here in a temporarily assumed human form. Okay? Now, fast forward to the New Testament. I would argue that the entire ministry of Jesus could be summed up under that title of fighting with God. Because what finally happens? So this is my big theory about everything from Genesis to Revelation. That when people fight other people, say Cain fighting with his brother, with Abel, or other people fighting with other people, a lot of times what's happening is the person that they are fighting against is God in effigy. Because people are really mad at God, but they can't get their hands on God. So they get their hands on somebody else. I mean, we're all familiar with, people lashing out at others because they're filled full of self-hatred, right? Yeah. A lot of times you have kind of this God hatred. But here's the problem. You can't get your hands on God. Cain was not really mad at his brother. No. Cain was mad at God. But he couldn't get his hands on God's throat to choke him out. So instead, he got his hands on his brother. So a lot of what we see in the world with regard to anger, violence, bloodshed, is nothing more than people transforming their vertical hatred for God horizontally so they take it out on the people who are around them. It's a theology problem, in other words. Violence at its root is a theology problem. People are mad at God, so they take out their anger on other people. That's what happened with Cain and Abel, and that ultimately takes us to the Gospels. So what happens there? Well, now it turns out God has flesh and blood. Turns out you can actually get your hands now on God. Well, just imagine what humanity is going to do when they can actually get their hands on God. What are they going to do? Kill him. Yeah, they're going to kill him. And that's exactly what you see prefigured all throughout the Old Testament. Now, this is the real beauty, though. I mean, that part's ugly. Humanity kills God. That part is certainly ugly. But here's the real beauty. If you look at the ministry of Jesus, it's the ministry of people wrestling with him. His own people fighting him, wrestling with him. Until finally, they pin him, quite literally, to the cross. And he lets them do it so that he can lose. And in him losing, we win. So the way I like to describe what's happening in this part of Genesis is that this is a keyhole, and you're looking through it, and what you see on the other side of that is the room of the crucifixion, where finally humanity gets their hands on God. They fight him, they pin him, he willingly loses in order that you might win. And in winning, God gets what he wants, and he bestows on us a new name as well. We get to be called the beloved of God, the forgiven of God, the children of God, part of the bride of Christ. So it's talking about God not having ego. I mean, it's amazing. God is like, oh yeah, I'm down for losing. I am all about that, because I know that in losing, my people will win.
The first becoming last and the last becoming first. I mean, this is like, when Jesus says this sort of stuff, he's ultimately talking about himself. So the last is everybody, and the first is him, and he's going to need to reverse this whole thing, right? So like, he was going to become last so that everybody else can become first, because he's not afraid of losing.
Yeah.
Oh, and you see hints of that all throughout the Old Testament. One of those hints is how often you see barren people suddenly be given the gift of children. Mm-hmm. How often you see the firstborn suddenly get reversed and the secondborn becomes the child of blessing. So this picture is a theme all throughout the scriptures, where God is constantly reversing the natural order, the things that we assume are natural, in order to bless us in ways that we never really anticipated or even thought we needed.
Yeah. So we're verse 29. Then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. And this is what Dan was alluding to earlier. He responds, why do you want to know? Why is it that you ask my name? Which is a typical Jesus response, isn't it? You know, he never responds in the way that we expect him to. We've already seen that in a lot of the presentations, you know, where people will say something to Jesus or ask him something, and he never responds in the way that you think that a normal human being would respond. So here too, why do you ask my name? And this actually fits with the account in the book of Judges when he appears to the parents of Samson. And they want to know who this is too, and his name is Wonderful. That is, it's beyond comprehension. Mm-hmm. So that's how he responds with regard to Jacob's question. Okay, verse 30.
By the way, his name is Jesus. The thing is that like, since like Gabriel can come and like said, hey, you're going to name this person, he doesn't tell anyone in the Old Testament his name. That's reserved for the opening chapters of Matthew. So until then, he's just like, you don't need to know.
You'll find out.
Yeah, you'll find out.
Sooner or later. And
he just blesses him out. I mean, he doesn't, no more discussion.
Yeah.
There's no more dialogue. It's like,
no more discussion.
You're done.
Yeah. And speaking of that, something I forgot to mention. So this is this is interesting about the name change. So what other names are changed before this? You remember? Abraham. Okay, so Abraham, when we meet him, he's Abram. And then he gets changed to Abraham. And his wife's named Sarai, but she gets changed to Sarah. Now here's an interesting fact about these name changes. If you look at all the other subsequent occurrences of Abraham's name, it's always Abraham. He's never called Abram again. Every time is Abraham. You look at the occurrences of Sarah after her name is changed. She's never called Sarai again. She's always called Sarah. But if you begin at Genesis 33 and you keep reading the story of this guy whose name was just changed, over half the time, he's not referred to as Israel. Mm-hmm. He's still referred to as Jacob. So here's the way I think about it. He was given a new name, to be sure, but it's more like he was given a second name. Mm-hmm. So now you're no longer just Jacob, you're also Israel. And there's really no discernible difference between the usages. In fact, these will be like woven together. One verse is Jacob, and one verse is Israel. Now, this is probably reading way too much into this, but this is the point I like to make with regard to this name change. And that is that Jacob remained Jacob even after he was Israel. Mm-hmm. Just like all of us, when we're brought to Christ, we're given a new name. Now you are Christian. Now you are righteous. Now you are forgiven. Now you're a saint of God. And you're also still a sinner. You're also still unrighteous in and of yourself. You also still have sin. In and of yourself, you're still Jacob. You're still a heel. Sorry, but you're still a heel. But you're also, at the same time, Israel. You're also Christian. You're forgiven. You're a saint. And so even in that way, carrying these two names, both of which have a history, both of which have a meaning, both of which have an implication, we also learn a little bit about ourselves as well. Verse 30. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, which is what that name means, the face of God. Yet my life has been preserved. Now, why does he add that last little bit? Yet my life has been preserved. Because if you see God, what's supposed to happen to you? You die. In fact, even it said, if you see my face, then you will die. And yet here he is still living and breathing. And not only living and breathing, but he's got a great new name too. So what gives here? Well, what gives here is, and we've been talking about this all through, kind of between the lines, that this is one more instance where God places himself into a position where people can see him. He adapts himself to their capability to see him so that they actually will not be destroyed when this happens. And the way that he does this in this narrative is not by appearing as a flaming fire inside a bush like he does in Exodus 3 or in any of the number of other ways that he does this. But what he does here is he appears as an actual flesh and blood man.
Yeah.
I mean, flesh and blood enough to where he's wrestling. And you can't get much more flesh and blood than that. So this is one more instance where, as Dan pointed out at the very beginning, you have a Christophany. That is an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. So he is appearing here with this human form that's capable of, brawn and sweat and wrestling and all this kind of stuff as a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in his incarnation when he takes on our flesh and blood, so that when you see God, when you see Jesus, you can say, there's Peniel, there's the face of God, right there. There's the fullness of God incarnate for us, so that when we see Jesus, we don't see most of God. When you see Jesus, you don't see 99% of God. There's no 1% of God that's hiding behind the back of Jesus. The fullness of God is in him. So if you want to know if you want to know what God is like, then you simply look at Jesus. That's the full disclosure.
I'm just reminded of course, that marvelous passage from John 1:14, where describing Jesus, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory," something that in the Old Testament was the force behind what killed sinners. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, but what is he full of? Grace and truth.
Verse 31. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore to this day the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip, which is something all of you are just fascinated by, right? Like, wow, an epiphany. Why was this included? Right? This is kind of a strange thing. You're going through the narrative. It's very brief. It's packed with a lot of stuff. It's fascinating. And then you would think at the climax of this, you're going to get this, it's going to be an awesome ending. And you're like, what? That's why you don't eat that part of the hip? That's really the way you're going to wrap up this fascinating story? Well, I think it is. So this is why I think that this was actually a perfect ending to this story. Y'all ready? So let's say you're looking generations down the road, And a father and a son they're butchering a sheep or whatever they are. They're dealing with cutting up the various parts of the animal. And the son says, "What about this part, Dad?" And Dad, "Oh, no, we don't eat that part of the animal." And the son says, "Why is that?" And Dad says, "Let me tell you a story." And the story he tells is this one about Jacob wrestling and what God did to Jacob's hip that day. And in that way, the memory of this encounter and of Jacob's injury and probably his lifelong limp afterward becomes a living memory in the heart of God's people. Because, and this is my main takeaway from this part of it, because God never wants us to forget our woundedness as a result of where he touched us that resulted in a limp that we still have to this day. I think it's good for us to ever keep fresh in our minds our wounds and our scars and our limps, because these become the way in which we remember our own weakness and our own woundedness and God's strength and his healing in our lives. See, there's a lot of bad things that have happened to us that, what do we like to do with the bad things that have happened to us? Shove them deep inside.
Yep.
Yeah, keep it deep inside. Don't let anybody see it. Don't let yourself see it, even though we all know that we see it, right? We like to keep that buried deep inside.
This is the way I was taught.
Yeah. That's the way,
Like a real man.
Real man, you keep it deep inside. Well, this is not keeping it deep inside. This is stamping the memory of this occurrence upon every animal that is owned by an Israelite afterward. Don't eat that. Why not? Because of the limp, because of the wound, because of the divine encounter that Jacob had. So we all have scars, we all have wounds, we all have limps, and we have those for a reason. We have them, first of all, to remind ourselves of whatever encounter we had in life with God that left us that way. But it's not really for us. The reason that we have these scars and wounds and limps is so that, having been comforted by God and healed by God of what we went through, we can then turn around and we can say to our brother or to our sister, "I know what you're going through, and let me tell you about what God did for me when I went through that very same thing." And so it becomes an opportunity for us to be good stewards of our scars, good stewards of our limps, that we can show compassion, comfort, concern, and love to other people who are limping, who are wounded, who are scarred. And that's why I think that narrative ends the way it does.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, Jacob is walking around with a limp for the rest of his life. He's who knows how many times he was asked by other people,
What happened?
Yeah,
"Hey, how'd you get that limp?" It's like you might imagine. I've been asked a lot of times, "What does that tattoo mean? What does that tattoo mean?" And it's like right on your body. And some people, by the way, there's not that many interesting stories about any of these, so you don't need to ask me. It's not that interesting. But still, it gets asked a lot because it's right there and everyone can see it, and they're like, "Oh, what does that mean? Why'd you get that?" And the same thing happens with the things we endure in life, where someone may ask you, then, "How'd you get that scar?" Or "How'd you get that limp?" "Oh, well," and then of course, I mean, can you imagine? "Hey, where'd you get that limp?" "Oh, I was wrestling with God one night. He jumped me out of nowhere, changed my name, gave me a blessing that is not in here. Apparently that wasn't the important part. And I've been limping ever since." And then he would say, "Yeah, but seriously, like, how'd you get it?"
Oh, it really happened. Great story, but what actually happened?
What'd you fall off of, really, though?
Great story, bro. Well, and to get back to to both your guys' point, I mean, this is what the New Testament also teaches. I mean, I've been the recipient of this. I've been used in certain situations to share my own scars and my own pains to minister to people. And this is the pattern that you see with God's church too. If you go to 2 Corinthians 1, right at the opening of that letter, the Apostle Paul says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that, that's a purpose statement, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. So it's just part of the pattern.
Yeah, this is the way that God works. It's the way He worked in Jacob's life. That's the way that He works in our own lives. And when you think about it, who still had wounds even after His resurrection? Our Lord. And those wounds testify to not just His past, but also to the life and the healing that we have in that past, as well as our hope of full and complete resurrection healing in the life to come.
Amen.
Amen.
That's it.
We're at the
That's
end,
it.
yeah.
That's 40 minutes. That's a wrap. Guys, thanks for hanging out with us.
Thanks.